5. So this week I'm going to be reading you chapters from Holes, which is what our English learning journey is based on. And throughout the videos, while I'm reading, I'm going to ask you different questions, book browse style questions, and then you can pause the YouTube video and answer the questions. So, we're going to start from chapter 2 because you looked at chapter 1 in English already. So, chapter 2 is very, very small, so let's have a look. So, the reader is probably asking, why would anyone go to Camp Green Lake? Well, most campers weren't given a choice. Camp Green Lake is a camp for bad boys. If you take a bad boy and make him dig a hole every day in the hot sun, it will turn him into a good boy. This is what some people thought. Stanley Yelnats was given a choice. The judge said, you may go to jail or you may go to Camp Green Lake. Stanley was from a poor family. He'd never been to a camp before. Ooh. What do you think Stanley might think Camp Green Lake is like? Just from that sentence, he'd never been to a camp before. Stanley Yelnats was the only passenger on the bus, not counting the driver or the guard. The guard sat next to the driver with his seat turned around facing Stanley and a rifle lay across his lap. Why do you think the guard is sitting like that? And why do you think he has the rifle? Stanley was sitting about 10 rows back, handcuffed to his armrest. His backpack lay next to him. It contained his toothbrush, toothpaste, a box of stationery his mother had given him, and he'd promised to write her a letter at least once a week. He looked out the window, but there wasn't much to see, mostly fields of hay and cotton. He was on a long bus ride to nowhere. The bus wasn't air-conditioned, and the hot, heavy air was almost as stifling as the handcuffs. Stanley and his parents had tried to pretend that he was just going to camp for a while, like the rich kids do. When Stanley was younger, he used to play with stuffed animals and pretend the animals were at camp. Camp fun and games, he called it. Sometimes he'd have them play soccer with a marble, and other times they'd run an obstacle course or go on bungee jumping off the table. And he tied rubber bands to them. Now Stanley tried to pretend he was going to camp fun and games. Maybe he'd make some friends, he thought. At least he'd get to swim in the lake. What does the reader know that Stanley doesn't know? He looked at the guard, who had sat slumped in his seat, and wondered if he'd fallen asleep. The guard was wearing sunglasses, so Stanley couldn't see his eyes. Stanley was not a bad kid. He was innocent of the crime for which he'd been convicted. He'd just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it was all because of his no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. He smiled. It was a family joke. Whenever something went wrong, they always blamed Stanley's no good, dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-great-grandfather. Supposedly, he had a great-great-grandfather who had stolen a pig from a one-legged gypsy, and she'd put a curse on him and all his descendants. What do you think descendants mean? Think about what we know about Stanley's family. Stanley and his parents didn't believe in curses, of course. But when anything went wrong, it was good to be able to blame someone. And things went wrong a lot. They seemed to always be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Stanley's father was an inventor. To be a successful inventor, you need 3 things: intelligence, perseverance, and a little bit of luck. Well, Stanley's father was smart. He had lots of perseverance. Once he started a project, he would work on it for years, often going days without sleep, but he just never had any luck. And every time an experiment failed, Stanley could hear him cursing his dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-grandfather. Stanley's father was also named Stanley Yelnats. Stanley's father's full name was Stanley Yelnats III. Our Stanley in our story, is Stanley Yelnats IV. Everyone in his family had liked the fact that Stanley Yelnats was spelt the same forward and backwards. So they kept naming their sons Stanley. Stanley was an only child, as was every other Stanley Yelnats before him. All of them had something in common. Despite their awful luck, they always remained hopeful. As Stanley's father used to say, I learned from failure. But perhaps this was part of the curse as well. If Stanley and his father weren't always hopeful, then it wouldn't hurt so much every time their hopes were crushed. Not every Stanley Yelnats has been a failure, Stanley's mother often pointed out whenever Stanley or his father became so discouraged that they actually started to believe in the curse. The first Stanley Yelnats, Stanley's great-grandfather, made a fortune in the stock market. He can't have been too unlucky. But at such times, she neglected to mention the bad luck that befell the first ever Stanley Yelnats. He lost his entire fortune when he was moving from New York to California. He was robbed by the outlaw, Kissing Kate Barlow. I wonder what an outlaw means. If you think you know what it means, see if you can use a different word for the outlaw, Kissing Kate Barlow. If it weren't for that, Stanley's family would be living in a mansion on a beach in California. Instead, they were in a crammed, tiny apartment that smelt of burning rubber and foot odour. If only. The apartment smelled the way it did because Stanley's father was trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers, which are trainers. The first person who finds a use for old sneakers, he said, will be a very rich man. It was the latest project that led to Stanley's arrest. The bus ride became increasingly bumpy and the road was no longer paved. Actually, Stanley had been impressed when he found out that his great-grandfather was robbed by Kissing Kate Barlow. True, he would prefer to be living on a beach in California, but it was kind of cool to have someone in your family robbed by a famous outlaw. But Kate Barlow didn't actually kiss Stanley's great-grandfather. That would have been really cool. But she only kissed the men she killed. Instead, she robbed him and left him stranded in the middle of the desert. He was lucky to survive, Stanley's mum was quick to point out. The bus was slowing down. The guard grunted as he stretched out his arms. Welcome to Camp Green Lake, said the driver. Stanley looked out the window. He couldn't see a lake, and hardly anything was green. Chapter 4. Stanley felt somewhat dazed as the guard unlocked his handcuffs and led him off the bus. He'd been on the bus for over 8 hours. Be careful, the bus driver said as Stanley walked down the steps. Stanley wasn't sure if the bus driver had meant for him to be careful going down the steps, or if he was telling him to be careful at Camp Green Lake. Thanks for the ride, he said. His mouth was dry and his throat hurt. He'd stepped onto the hard, dry dirt. There was a band of sweat around his wrist where the handcuff had been. The land was barren and desolate. Those would be 2 really good words to use in tomorrow's lesson. Barren and desolate. He could see a few run-down buildings and some tents, and further away there was a cabin between 2 tall trees. Those 2 trees were the only plant life he could see. There weren't even weeds. There weren't even weeds. What does that suggest about Camp Green Lake? The guard led Stanley to a small building. A sign on front said, "You are entering Camp Green Lake Juvenile Correction Facility." Next to it was another sign which declared that it was not allowed for anybody to bring in guns, explosive, weapons, alcohol into Camp Green Lake. As Stanley read the sign, he couldn't help but think, well, duh. Obviously you can't bring those things in. Why do you think Camp Green Lake had that sign up? The guard led Stanley into a building where he felt the welcome relief of air freshening. A man was sitting up with his feet on a desk. He turned his head when Stanley and the guard entered, but otherwise didn't move. Even though he was inside, he wore sunglasses and a cowboy hat. He held a can of soda, and the sight of it made Stanley even more aware of his own thirst. He waited while the bus guard gave the man some papers to sign. "That's a lot of sunflower seeds," the guard said. Stanley noticed a sack filled with sunflower seeds on the floor next to the desk. "Yeah, I quit smoking last month," said the man. He had a tattoo of a rattlesnake on his arm, and as he signed his name, the snake's rattle seemed to wiggle. "I used to smoke a pack a day. Now I eat a sack of these every week." The guard laughed. There must have been a small refrigerator behind his desk, because the man in the cowboy hat produced 2 more cans of soda. For a second, Stanley hoped that one might be for him, but the man gave one to the guard and the other was for the driver. 9 hours here and back," the guard grumbled. "What a day." Stanley thought about the long, miserable bus ride and felt a bit sorry for the guard and the bus driver. The man in the cowboy hat spit sunflower seed shells into the waste paper basket. He walked around the desk to Stanley. "My name is Mr. Sir," he said. "Whenever you speak to me, you must call me by my name. Is that clear?" Stanley hesitated. Yes, Mr. Sir," he said. "You're not in the Girl Scouts anymore," Mr. Sir said. "You're not in the Girl Scouts anymore?" Stanley was never in the Girl Scouts. What does Mr. Sir mean by that? Stanley had to remove all his clothes in front of Mr. Sir, so he made sure he wasn't hiding anything. Then he was given 2 sets of clothes and a towel. Each set consisted of a long-sleeved orange jumpsuit, an orange t-shirt, and yellow socks. Stanley wasn't sure if the socks had been yellow originally. He was also given white sneakers, an orange cap, and a canteen, which is like a drink container, made of heavy plastic, which was unfortunately empty. The cap had a piece of cloth sewn on the back of it for neck protection. Stanley got dressed, and Mr. Sir told him that he would wear 1 set to work in and 1 set for relaxation. Laundry was done every 3 days. On that day, his work clothes would be washed, and the other set would become his work clothes, and then he would get clean clothes to wear while resting. "You are to dig 1 hole each day, including Saturdays and Sundays. Each hole must be 5 feet deep and 5 feet across in each direction." So I want you to imagine a hole that is the length of 1 Mrs. Littlewood. Okay, so quite a big hole, and the depth of the hole is 1 Mrs. Littlewood as well. So it's quite a big hole. Okay, even though Mrs. Littlewood is small, it's still a big hole. Your shovel is your measuring stick. How big is the shovel? Breakfast is served at 4:30. Stanley looked surprised, because Mr. Sir went on to explain that they have to start early to avoid the hottest part of the day. "No one's going to babysit you," he added. "The longer it takes you to dig, the longer you'll be out in the sun. If you dig up anything interesting, you'll report it to me or any other counsellor. When you finish, the rest of the day is yours." Stanley nodded, to show he understood. "This isn't a Girl Scout camp," said Mr. Sir. He checked Stanley's backpack and allowed him to keep it. Then he led Stanley outside into the blazing sun. "Take a good look around you," Mr. Sir said. "What do you see?" Stanley looked around the vast wasteland. Another great phrase to use tomorrow, vast wasteland. The air seemed thick with heat and dirt. "Not much," he said. "Mr. Sir?" Mr. Sir laughed. "You see any guard towers?" "No." "What about an electric fence?" "No, Mr. Sir." "There's no fence at all, is there?" "No, Mr. Sir." "You want to run away?" Mr. Sir asked him. Stanley looked back at him. "If you want to run away, go ahead, start running. I'm not going to stop you." Stanley didn't know what kind of game Mr. Sir was playing. "I see you're looking at my gun. Don't worry, I'm not going to shoot you." He tapped his holster. "This is for yellow-spotted lizards. I wouldn't waste a bullet on you." "I'm not going to run away," Stanley said. Good thinking, said Mr. Sir, because nobody runs away from here. We don't need a fence. Know why? Because we've got the only water for 100 miles. You want to run away? You'll be buzzard food in 3 days. What does Mr. Sir mean by that? You'll be buzzard food in 3 days. Stanley could see some kids dressed in orange, carrying shovels, dragging themselves towards the tent. You thirsty? Asked Mr. Sir. Yes, Mr. Sir, Stanley said gratefully. Well, you better get used to it. You're going to be 30 for the next 18 months.